Hi, my name's Harry. Welcome to another episode of Welding Fabrication. Today we're going to be looking at the safe use of angle grinders, and also we're going to be looking at the discs available depending upon the application in terms of what you're going to be using them for. So run through on the grinder itself. So the angle grinder, we're going to be looking at a 4.5 inch angle grinder, and this is a brand new one. And in terms of the actual setups, we've got the main part where we put our grinding disc onto. This is made up of two parts. You've got a backing plate and a locking nut that goes over the top. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. On the side, you have a handle to help support hold the grinder when you're in use. And also there's a switch on the side here, which is to turn it on and off. In addition to that, there is a locking button on the top, and that allows us to lock the grinding chuck off, just so that when we're putting a different disc on, allows us to be able to undo it. In addition to that, we've got a guard which protects the actual grind disc, so when it's on in place, or the cutting disc, it means that your fingers are going to be nowhere near the disc when that's rotating. In terms of the actual handle, depending on whether you're left or right-handed, the handle cannot go on the opposing side. It could be down to access. What I would say to that is, I'm left-handed, and I still use it like a right-handed person. And the reason for that is because good easy access, that I can hold the handle with my left hand, and then the body of the grinder I can hold with my right hand, and the switch I can then roll on and off with my thumb. Now, you always want to have your thumb pretty close. It doesn't have to be bang on it, but it needs to be pretty close in terms of when you're grinding. So if you need to turn it off in a hurry, you can turn it off. Okay, and one of the things I would say is that when it's off, when it's on rather, you push it on and push it forward, it locks in place. And you see it locks in place there. But all you have to do is just literally push down on it, and that will flick off when you turn it off. So you can see that when you push down on the back of that button, that will turn straight off. Whereas you have to physically push it forward and rock it to get it to lock into place. For a 4.5 inch grinder, I would say these Bosch ones, personally, they're probably one of the better styles of grinders. You can get them with the buttons on the top, in the middle. Always, for me, I always try and get one with one on the side. It just means that you've got better hold and stance with the grinder in terms of when you're using it. Okay, so the different sorts of discs we've got available. I've just got a few that we're going to look at. So we've got what's called a sanding pad, and this has what's called a backing pad to it as well. So that helps support, so when it goes onto the angle grinder, helps support this disc. It's quite flexible. These are really cheap in comparison to a lot of other discs that are available. And they're more of a throwaway item very, very quickly. They don't last particularly very long. Get different grits. So the actual grit on this pad itself, I think this is an 80 grit. They all say on the back, so an 80 grit. Different grits basically will dictate how much material you're going to take off when you're actually grinding or sanding the material. Another addition or another option, this is a 60 grit. This is what we call a flat disc. Goes onto the grinder in a slightly different way. But what it does is it's got little rows, you can see flaps of sandpaper on there, or in terms of this cloth, like emery cloth. And in the same method, in terms of the sanding pad, this will grind down, but you'll find that you can be very easily, you can dish into the material by using one of these. Much more aggressive in terms of the amount of material that's taken off than if you were using a sanding pad. The other option is obviously if you're grinding quite hard materials, or you're going into the range of being able to grinding welds out, it could be, is the grinding disc itself. So this particular one, this is a 6mm thick grinding disc. This can be used end on, but it can also be used at an angle to grind across the face of a piece of material. Two cutting discs that I've got here. One is a 3mm cutting disc. You can see they're a lot thinner now in comparison to a 6mm grinding disc. Now, I just state this is a grinding and this is a cutting disc. And the difference between the two is you wouldn't use this one at an angle for grinding across the face of material. You would only use that edge for actually grinding into or cutting into the face of a piece of material. The same with a 1mm cutting disc as well. The reason for that is because the fibres that these discs are made up in, if you reduce the cross-sectional area, i.e. if you use it for grinding rather than cutting, then what happens is you take down the layers of fibre, and they're more likely to then shatter or break up when you start using them. Okay? Right, so I just want to show you how to put a disc on safely and make sure it's secure. So we'll do one of these, a couple of these discs first, and then we'll come across to the sanding pad after. So we have our locking nut on there. Like I said before, on the button there, generally what I do is always make sure it's unplugged first, which it is. You can see the turn the switch on, so it's unplugged, just for safety reasons more than anything. So I'm going to press the button at the back there, get it to a position where it locks, and then I can rotate this nut off like so. Now this backing one has a slot in it, so it's not round, and on the grinder itself you can see it's shaped in the same way, so you want to make sure that locates correctly onto that part of the grinder. Now the next thing you want to look at is depending upon the thickness of the disc you're going to be fitting. So if we look for instance at a 6mm disc or a 1mm disc, there's a big difference between the two in terms of thickness. On the locking nut itself, one side has got a recess and the other side has got a point, a bit that sticks out. So if you're using thicker material, or a thicker disc should I say, that section there would sit down into the disc like so, and then when it locates onto the grinder, that effectively would help clamp it in place. If for instance you used a 1mm disc, you can see that thickness is already through. So if you put that disc on and we locked it down for argument's sake, just to show you, we rotate that on there, that's almost fully locked out, and you can see there's a lot of play in it already. By this recess, if we swap that round, and we're just going to turn it over so that metal ring is sitting flat onto the face of the grinding bed itself. We're going to turn it over, and this metal ring here, we're going to sit down onto the grinder, and you can see there straight away, even finger tight, that's much tighter, it's much more secure. At which point in time, there's a variety of different grinding keys available. This is the one that came with the grinder, and you'll find that these holes on the back, across there, if we lock that out, so we lock that button out again, and then we locate that grinder key into those two holes. We'll do it around this way. Let's just turn it around. There you go, so locked off there. Then we can put it on like so and just tweak that and make sure it's locked nice and tight. Just the same as when you're taking them off, you put your finger on like so. Now depending upon your grinder key you're using, an example of different grinder keys available, this one, you can see that the actual centres on the two pins are completely different. And what you'll find is there'll be a specific grinder key for the grinder you're using, but on this particular locking nut, and a lot of them do have that, is that you've actually got, won't fit in this way round, but this way round with this key, that'll fit. So you can actually unlock that and bring it off like so. Okay? When you're using the sanding pad itself, like so, won't always fit on, so you can see there, it's not going to quite enough thread to go through, so you have to take the backing pad off as well, at which point in time you can then drop it down. I'm just going to do it up finger tight to start off with, like so. And to be honest with you, hand tight is more than enough for that once it's nice and tight. If you're a little bit unsure, you haven't particularly got the strength in your hand, again you can always use a key and you can always just make sure it's nice and tight. Okay, so we've got our sanding pad that we can then use. Sanding pads should never be used end on. They should always be used across the face of the material, okay? And again, if you're using the sanding pad, you should always bring it down. Don't go flat onto the material. You should always come down approximately about 10 to 15 degrees. So you're going to apply a load across that face of the disc, but that face, you can see that that disc is going to flex ever so slightly anyway. So depending upon how much load you apply, will dictate how much pressure or how much of the material you're going to take away. So what you will find is, find that locking point. So you see a little bit, you can get this one undone by hand, and a lot of the time, potentially you can. What we're going to do is, I'll just show you the difference between using a grinding disc and say, a cutting disc. So I'm going to put a grinding disc on like so, backing that on, and we're going to return, and again, make sure we've got that section that's sticking out there on that locking nut facing down, so it locks in against the disc, like so. Lock that up, and we can always just give that a little tweak, make sure it's nice and tight. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn on, just put it in. Right, now the next thing is in terms of PPE, there's loads of different things available that you can potentially use. I've just given a couple of options here, so I've got a pair of goggles, a pair of safety specs, ear defenders. You've got the option of either using ear plugs, like so, so you twist these in your fingers, or say roll them in your fingers, and then put them into your ears. The other option is, which is my preferred option if I'm using a grinder and then potentially welding or lots of other things, is a set of earplugs like this. You can wash them as well. They're an individual thing, whereas these are a throw item, one use. You would potentially put them in your ears, and when you finish with them, you throw them away, whereas these you can put back in your pot and you can actually wash them. They go around your neck like so, and they just go in your ears like this. So much easier to use. The other alternative is a set of ear defenders. The only trouble with ear defenders like this is that they can be quite bulky, and they can get in the way. So if you're wearing a welding helmet or something like that, can be a problem. If you're just grinding, absolutely fine. See, they come on like this, and you'd have a headband, and often they'll adjust on the straps on the side. Okay? I'm going to use, for now, I'm going to use my in-ear plugs. What I'm going to do is, I'm just going to show you, angles-wise, what you'll be doing, and just grind across the face of the material, and then I'll swap over to a cutting disc, and then I'll just show you very briefly how you would cut through the face of a piece of material as well. Okay? Right, so angles of the angle grinder, let me safety specs. Angles of the angle grinder are important. So again, much like using the sanding pad, you've got two options with this. You can either use the face, or you can use the disc itself. So rather than coming in flat, we're going to come in at a slight angle, again about 15 degrees, and we're going to grind across the face of the material like so. Now, two really, really important things when using any sort of cutting disc, sanding pad, grinding wheel, whatever it might be, is never ever start the grinder up with it on the material, because it's going to whip away from you as it starts up. And secondly, until it stops spinning, don't put it down. Okay? Because again, you put it down, that can whip off, that could cut through a piece of material, it could cut through a cable, anything like that. And the other thing is that by slowing it down, and if you think, oh, I can stop it faster, so you take your finger off the trigger and then slow it down in the face of the material, what that does is it wears an uneven amount of material off of the disc, and if you do it enough times and you're not using the disc very often, that disc can then become imbalanced, and then it causes a lot of vibration, potentially within the body of the grinder itself when you're trying to use it. Okay? Right, so what we're going to do, I'll put my ear defenders and plugs in a second, and all I'm going to do is start the grinder up, bring it over, get it fully up to speed, bring it over at a slight angle, and then I'm just going to grind across the face of the material like so. Okay, always be aware of the environment you're in, so make sure that the sparks aren't going to be going into something that's potentially flammable or explosive, so it's worth putting screens up or making sure you're in a well ventilated area as well in terms of the grinding dust. In terms of grinding dust, it's worth wearing a mask because grinding dust from a grinder in terms of mild steel is deemed to be carcinogenic. Okay, right, so earplugs in, put my specs on like so. Make sure I'm nice and protected. So I'll start the grinder up, and all I'm going to do is bring it down at 15 degrees, little grind across the face of the material. I'm not going to apply a huge amount of load, but what I am going to do is just grind back and forth like so. So you can see by grinding across the face of the material there, I've took this mill scale and this oxide layer off, and I've been left quite coarse, quite rough, but a surface that's been ground. Again, it's important, like I said to you before, when we put the grinder down, you can see in terms of the positioning, making sure it's not a high rotation. The other thing you want to make sure is that the discs you're using are for the correct size. This is a 4.5-inch grinder, so realistically, you only want to be using discs designed for this grinder itself. So what we're going to do is just take this disc off, and I'll just quickly show you the difference between grinding. Again, we could cut with the face of this disc, but this is a 1mm cutting disc. It's called an inox cutting disc. So they're designed inox, which is French. A lot of the time, in terms of inox, we're talking about it's on oxide. So an inox cutting disc is designed for cutting all sorts of materials, but much harder materials. It's designed for things like stainless steel. Mild steel is perfectly capable of cutting. All I'm going to do, again, it's about applying the right amount of load. So you don't want to just really push down on the grinder. What we're going to do is we're just going to cut into the face of the material. And again, the position of the guard, we could potentially change it, but the sparks at the moment are going to come off down in this direction away from us. So all I'm going to do is cut into the face of the material and then cut across. So it's an alternative. If you haven't got means to cut material, it could be a guillotine or a hand knife, whatever it might be, an iron worker, then an angle grinder is certainly an option available to you for cutting a piece of material. Right, so we're going to come in at an angle, straight down like so, start on the edge of the material once it's fully up to speed, and then we're going to cut across the face of the material. Just cut a line in it first, just almost like a track mark as to where we're going to be cutting, and then we're going to go back to the start and cut all the way through. Okay? So you can see there on the face of the material, under the device, on the face of the material there, we've got this burr on the back. It's quite a sharp burr, but we've cut through that face, and this material is 4mm thick. It's quite capable of cutting through this and much longer sections. And also, although I didn't mark it out, the actual cut itself is reasonably straight. Okay, so depending upon the application, it could be if you're cutting into, say, if you're grinding or say cutting out a weld, it could be you go for a bigger disc, say a 3mm. If you want to cut into, it could be a weld defect, or alternatively, if you're going and you're cutting into maybe a larger section of weld, it might be you go for a grinding disc instead and use the end face on that grinding disc. So depending on the application, there's lots of discs, and there are more to be fair, there's lots of discs available to you to help you with your application in terms of whatever you might be doing. Okay, thank you very much.